Mr. Chair, thank you very much. It's great to be here in West Virginia. West Virginia is very important to SREB. And I'm going to give my 12 minutes, of which 15 seconds are already gone. I will try to stick to this text. So I thank you very much to address this important topic. I'm going to make my remarks based on SREB's work with our 16 member states over the past 8 years in building statewide college-ready initiatives. The goal of these initiatives for each state is to increase significantly the number of high school graduates who have the reading, the writing, and the math-related skills needed to succeed in some form of post-secondary education. These readiness programs, along with post-secondary education completion, are central to state efforts to have competitive economies, to help more people qualify for jobs that help state economies and that enable their entry into higher income classes. SREB, along with Achieve, and you'll hear from the president of Achieve, Mike Cohen, a little bit, we've had these college and career-ready initiatives, and among others, there's 3 key steps. First is to have all post-secondary education in the state, and all of the public schools agree on one clear set of college career-ready standards in reading, writing, and math. The second step is to apply some kind of junior year high school assessments that measure students' progress on these post-secondary readiness standards in reading, writing, and math. And then third is to offer senior year courses for students not likely to meet the readiness standards. With these actions, statewide readiness can be increased and the need for college remediation taken care of when students are still in high school. Most important for today's session, the agreement on one set of standards by both post-secondary education and K-12 in a state is fundamental to these readiness initiatives. They anchor the entire statewide effort. One set of agreed upon standards is critical because post-secondary education then speaks with one voice in a state, sending clear signals to all of the public schools. Post-secondary education ensures that graduates meet these reading, writing, and graduates who do meet these reading, writing, and math standards will not have to take remedial education. The other important aspect of good state college and career readiness standards is that they actually, empirically, by fact, predict success in post-secondary education. That a set of standards do this or not is a knowable thing. Have a set of standards, assess how well students meet them, and then determine how well they do in post-secondary education. I want to emphasize that setting and applying these college and career-ready standards statewide is an unprecedented effort. This is what the Common Core standards try to do. It means that all K-12 schools in the state will be working off a set of standards that likely will be higher than in the past because they will signify post-secondary education readiness. We've never had statewide standards do this until the mid-2000s, 2010. At least for the medium term, this will mean that these higher readiness standards should not be used for high-stakes high school graduation, but to determine readiness for post-secondary education. So having one set of standards is critically important, along with ensuring they are rigorous enough to predict readiness for post-secondary education. At SREB, since 2007, we have argued that all states should have standards meeting these criteria relating to college and career readiness. We also believe that there's not only one set of standards in literacy and math that would meet these readiness requirements. We do believe that the Common Core state standards rise to the level of college and career readiness. That is why and how they were developed and researched. However, we have also supported states like Texas and Virginia that didn't adopt the Common Core and instead adopted other standards that have risen to the level of college and career readiness. What I hope we don't lose sight of as states, and there are many of them, review and reconsider the Common Core, is that where states were 7 to 8 years ago before the Common Core. Studies from the Fordham Foundation, which I think is popularly seen as being more conservative leaning, and without a stake in the Common Core back in 2010, looked at all the state standards before the Common Core. They found a tremendous variation across states. They actually found that somewhere near 40 states, either in English or literacy, math, or both, did not come up to the level of college and career readiness. Our take on these findings was that while there's nothing necessarily wrong in interstate variation, the finding that nearly 80% of the states were not close to the performance expected by the Common Core was troubling. In this light, we supported all state efforts to ensure that standards came up to college and career readiness levels, whether the exact Common Core standards were used or not. To be sure, this means practically showing that any standards adopted should strongly predict success in post-secondary education as well, which was the goal on which the Common Core was based. What I mainly wanted to talk about here, and I'll do it briefly, was my field has always been higher education. And back in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2002, at California State University, we realized that we had to work much more closely with the public schools to make sure that all schools understood what our readiness standards were. We started a project, and it was important that it was California State University because it is the largest state university system, 450,000 students. We would take in about 70,000 freshmen a year. We had to be sure that we had readiness standards that truly predicted success, or not, because or not, students went into very expensive remedial education. So we worked with our faculties on developing a set of readiness standards in literacy, reading and writing, and then in math. Another reason we worked hard on that is that we're working very closely with the State Board of Education on ways to be clear and more forceful and consistent about what high school students needed to be able to do if they were to succeed in post-secondary. What were the findings of all this, which involved about 2,000 English faculty and 1,500 math faculty? First, what we found about readiness standards from these, and they were evidence-based studies by our faculties, they're carried out in cooperation with the school. These findings enabled us to build and refine a very effective readiness standards and assessment process. Our goal was to set performance expectations in reading, writing, and math. Here were the major findings. In literacy, and remember, this was 8 years before the Common Core. In literacy, or reading and writing, first, we found that the readiness standards needed to emphasize, to a greater extent, information text. This is not to say that literature text should be made less significant, particularly in English courses, only that success in post-secondary education has a lot more to do with a student's skill in reading, information, or explanatory text in all other subject areas. And this is where most college courses are based. Second, students need to be able to read information text at least to the point of fully comprehending their meaning, which is fundamental to higher forms of reading and writing, like critical analysis, argumentation, and so on. An important corollary to these reading standards based on comprehending information text is the need for writing standards that call for students to at least be able to explain in writing what they have read. Third, the third emphasis of the literacy standards we found critical emphasized the need to challenge students to read text of appropriate complexity, ensuring that students at each grade level and culminating in high school are progressively reading more complicated, challenging texts will be typical in post-secondary education. This is essential if higher reading and writing skills are to be achieved. Fourth, from the post-secondary education perspective, we found that students were not getting enough help in how to read with comprehension across different subject areas: history, science, math, how to read math. We found that the skills needed to read history effectively differed from reading literature, from reading science, from reading math, and so on. These findings were used to form our messages to the public schools about the skills needed to be ready for a university system. In math, applying the same process with our faculties, they found that for non-STEM majors, for students not going into engineering or math, the following skills were most important to be ready: number sense, quantitative reasoning and estimation, conceptual understanding, procedural fluency through Algebra 1, geometry, and some of Algebra 2, math skills application, statistical and probability skills, and reasoning. The point I want to make about this review and revision of post-secondary readiness skills 10 years ago is that the literacy and math skills identified by these post-secondary education faculty, and there were a lot of them, as predicting post-secondary readiness and success in 2002 are reflected in the Common Core now and in other readiness standards in non-Common Core states. Let me finish by saying that states are reviewing and considering standards is regularly done, typically on a 10-year cycle. But the standards change done in 2010, 2011 through the Common Core standards differed, to me, most significantly in its linkages to lining up K-12 standards with post-secondary education readiness. These standards do link to post-secondary readiness. A number of states are having similar discussions around the Common Core. Our hope at SREB, and we are working with several states in supporting this hope, is that every state will end up with standards that equal or exceed the extent to which students are expected, which schools are expected to make students college and career ready. And let me just say, you'll hear from Mike Cohen a little bit later, and based on that work in 2002 on readiness standards, I know we were invited to the American Diploma Project, in which 30 states, I think at least, were gathered together to consider the same kind of things, and I think Mike will talk more about that. Yes, I think my time is up. If not, I can go on. Let me just end by saying I think there is some urgency to this. West Virginia's already put in a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of time. We know this through our benchmarking report at SREB from 2012 to 2014. Any changes, any consideration, we believe respectfully that should be taken into account. Changing standards, while it's regularly done, it's an immense task. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
My name is Townette Salazar. I'm the State Relations Director for the Education Commission of the States. ECS was started in 1965 by states for states so that we could help states learn from each other in developing state-level policy work. We are nonpartisan, we don't take sides, and we are not an advocacy organization. My role here today is to explain what other states have done in the last legislative session, as well as gubernatorial action that took place during the 2014 session. Hank, if you wouldn't mind moving through maybe the first 4 or 5. Keep going. In addition, ECS covers the P20 spectrum. We do preschool all the way through post-secondary and workforce readiness. So dealing with the Common Core standards is not the only topic that ECS focuses on, but the bulk of our research that I've provided for the members today has 3 separate documents that I'll be working from. In addition, ECS receives the majority of its funding from state assessments. Hank, if you would go through the next 3 slides. Thank you. The bulk of my activity today will take place from a research publication that I was a co-author on in September of 2014 regarding states and the not-so-new standards. Members should have that in folders in front of them now. Through our research, ECS has realized that state legislatures are largely responsible for the adoption of state-level standards. State legislatures often delegate this responsibility to state boards of education and departments of education to implement standards. What we saw in the 2014 session were legislators trending towards adopting legislation to give them a role in the adoption process. In these standards, oftentimes they would introduce committees to review standards, or require public input at different meetings throughout the state in development of standards. In looking at the Common Core in 2010, 45 states and Washington, D.C. adopted the Common Core in English language arts and math. Minnesota opted to adopt in English only, feeling that their state-level standards were superior in their mind to the Common Core. 4 states, Alaska, Nebraska, Texas, and Virginia, never adopted the Common Core, but they did adopt new, more rigorous standards. What we see today is that 43 states in Washington, D.C. continue to operate under the Common Core standards for the 2014-15 school year. There are many states currently reviewing their standards while they are operating under Common Core. Most recently in the 2014 session, Missouri, North Carolina, and South Carolina passed legislation. They are currently reviewing their standards but are operating under the Common Core standards. Each state has taken a slightly different approach, and in the interest of time, I won't read their approaches to you. You have that in the documents in front of you. But they vary from looking at task force to review the standards to adopting new and additional standards while also considering the Common Core as a basis for those standards. Only 2 states have formally exited the Common Core, Oklahoma and Indiana. Both of those states have adopted new standards. Indiana moved very quickly and adopted standards in April. They're currently in the process of trying to select a new assessment. Oklahoma chose to revert back to their 2010 standards. Through that process, they lost their waiver under No Child Left Behind. In the meantime, they've been able to assert that their current standards are rigorous and college and career ready, and they have reapplied for their waiver for No Child Left Behind. Many states have taken action to reaffirm the Common Core. Many states are looking at reviewing their implementation and what they can do to strengthen implementation and support school districts and educators in the field. Several other states have chosen to affirm local control, stating that the standards are rigorous in the direction that the state would like to go, but they want to ensure that their state is in control of the curriculum and textbooks that are chosen to teach those standards. Other states, such as South Dakota, have chosen to say that they will stay the course with the Common Core, but any future standards that are developed must be run through the legislative process. Lastly, over 25 states have chosen to rename their state standards and/or modify the standards by adding additional elements into each of them, such as cursive. The next level of standards wouldn't be complete without discussing the assessment of those standards and how students master the levels that they're being assessed on. This is the second document that is in your packet called 50 Ways to Test. On the back part of this document, you have a table that gives you all of the assessments for every state and every grade level, grades 3 through 11, in each subject matter. This gives you an understanding of the types of assessments, which assessment consortium each state belongs to, and the subject matters and grades in which students will be tested for the current school year. What we have found from our research is that 12 states and Washington, D.C. will be administering the PARCC assessment in some capacity. All 12 of those states will be giving the PARCC assessment in grades 3 through 8, and 11 of those states will be testing at least in one of grade levels 9 through 12. For states belonging to the Smarter Balance Consortium, such as West Virginia, 18 of those states belong to that consortium currently, and will be administering those assessments in the 14-15 school year. All 18 of the states will be providing those assessments for students in grades 3 through 8, and 15 of those states will be testing in any capacity in high school. Of the states, 20 of them either never joined an assessment consortium or have currently left the consortium and will not be administering consortium tests. There are a few nuances to that. Massachusetts and Missouri will administer a combination of the tests. Massachusetts gave their school districts the option to choose between the PARCC assessment and their current state-level assessment for this year prior to making a decision for 2016. Other states have chosen to add additional assessments beyond what is required by the federal government, and also in subject matters such as science, social studies, and a few states have added additional writing assessments. Listed above on the screen are the requirements, the minimum federal testing requirements. And as you can see, math and reading are required in each of grades 3 through 8 and not less than one time in the high school grades. Science is required at least one time in the elementary grades 3 through 5, one time in middle school or grades 6 through 9, and one assessment in high school grades 10 through 12. In addition, there's criteria for assessments for special population for students with disabilities and English language learners, but I won't go into that today. So what we're finding is that the legislation is trending towards states taking additional steps to ensure that state-level standards are adopted by the state and endorsed by the state. We're seeing a large trend towards community input, parent input, and other avenues so that there's different education stakeholders within the state that have the opportunity to provide feedback into those standards. The last document that you have in your packet reviews the process for states who have chosen to entertain new standards. We have profiled 8 different states in that packet for you, notably Indiana, who recently went through their state adoption process, Oklahoma, who undertook theirs. We also chose to profile Texas and Virginia, who did not adopt the Common Core, and Minnesota, who chose to only adopt English language arts in the Common Core. We also chose to profile Missouri and North Carolina, who recently passed legislation and took 2 very different approaches, but valid approaches nevertheless. And with that, I think I will yield my time to whoever else needs some extra time.
We are parents, grandparents, and citizens, deeply concerned about our nation's education system. For the past 2 years, we have traveled the state, raising awareness about concerns with Common Core. We have talked with many of you. To those of you who would take the time to listen, we thank you. We also are grateful to Senator Donna Boley. It was Senator Boley who early on recognized this emerging educational crisis and our need to be heard. Without her, we would have no voice, and without her, we would not be here today. We have experts here today, Dr. Sandra Stotsky and Theodore Rebarber, to speak to you on the deficiencies of the Common Core standards. They come with no personal agenda, but only their own individual persistence to help save American education. They come with credentials and life accomplishments, which compel us to seek out and utilize their advice. Dr. Stotsky's accomplishments in Massachusetts schools are indisputable, and she is probably the most knowledgeable ELA expert in the world. We are privileged to have them both with us today. But Common Core is not just about standards. Common Core was built on false promises and deception. Beginning in 2009, the governors and state boards began to sign Common Core-related agreements and grant applications in exchange for federal stimulus money and NCLB waivers. The applications contain commitments to not only common standards, but to assessments, student data systems, teacher evaluations, and government intervention in low-performing schools. Common Core is not just about standards. And governors across the country signed Common Core-related agreements built on these false promises and deception. In 2009, in an agreement with the National Governors Association, the governors agreed to adopt common standards with the promise of rigor, college-ready, and internationally benchmarked standards. Standards not yet developed, not seen, not tried, not tested. In effect, they bought a house before it was built based on promises that have never materialized. 1 year later, the West Virginia State Board adopted the Common Core standards 1 month before they were finally released. That final release, not seen, not tried, not tested, all built on false promises. Next, to test the students on those standards, the governor joined the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, agreeing in that agreement to bind West Virginia to the decisions of that consortium. In effect, the governor relinquished our state sovereignty to a group, allowing that group to make educational assessment decisions for us. And that group, the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, then turned around and entered into a contract with the U.S. Department of Education and agreed to make student-level data that results from the assessments available to the Department of Education. The consortium decided that the federal government could have access to West Virginia student data. But of course, the agreement was subject to applicable privacy law. And this is the deception, the bait and switch. the U.S. DOE's big FERPA scam. After we adopted Common Core standards, we relinquished our state sovereignty by binding ourselves to the decisions of a group that agreed to hand over our student data to the federal government. The Department of Education altered the student privacy law, the very law that Congress intended to protect student data. Without going through Congress, without statutory change, the department redefined who can have access to student data. Jane Robbins of the American Principles Project put it this way: the public is unaware of this intrusion in their child's privacy. Not only will parents have no right to object to this sharing of their child's private data, they will probably never know it happened. Thus, not only did the governors relinquish our state sovereignty with these agreements, they also gave away our parental rights over our children's private information to the federal government. There have been many challenges to the department's unconstitutional FERPA changes. Notably, the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, with 2,600 higher education members and 10,000 campus enrollment officials with vast knowledge and experience with student data, wrote an 11-page document to the U.S. DOE, and I quote from that: "The proposed regulations have been overwhelmingly influenced by the single-issue lobbying of a well-financed campaign to promote a data free-for-all in the name of educational reform." And they go on: "The department lacks the legal authority to implement these changes through regulatory action." And a man named Paul Gamble, the director and chief official charged with protecting student data, was fired by the department. Gamble subsequently filed a whistleblower retaliation lawsuit against the department, believing he was fired due to his objections to the FERPA changes. In his legal complaint, he stated, "My FERPA attorneys, as well as the DOE attorneys that were familiar with FERPA, informed me that the proposed change required a statutory change in the law, and that the proposed regulatory change was illegal." Common Core is not just educational standards. It is about controlling education in America. It is about student data collection, cradle-to-grave tracking, and data mining. The testing consortiums are the central data collection point. In West Virginia, the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium began collecting its data last spring in the field tests, and it is scheduled for full implementation this spring. And the point is this: West Virginia has agreed to allow access to our student data without parental consent. Our student data is not safe, leaving our parents with only one alternative to protect their child's personal information. And that alternative is this: they must opt out of the state assessments. Opt out of the state assessments. And this body should be aware of a recent development with the Smarter Balanced. Apparently, member states must now pay membership dues to the consortium. On November 20 in Missouri, a judge issued a temporary restraining order to prohibit that state from making those dues payments, amounting to over $1 million to the Smarter Balance. And the order states, quote, "Plaintiffs have made a preliminary showing of likelihood of success on the merits on their claims that the consortium is an unconstitutional interstate compact to which Congress has never consented in violation of the Compact Clause of the United States Constitution." And this inevitably brings us to our own questions. Is West Virginia part of an illegal interstate compact? What are our consortium dues and other Smarter Balanced expenses? Will we ever see a full accounting of the cost to taxpayers for Common Core? It has now been 4 years since the West Virginia Board adopted Common Core standards, and almost 2 years since we went before them with our concerns. Instead of addressing our concerns, board members have painted us as right-wingers with a political agenda, holding political events. Any of you that attended our Bridgeport Forum with Dr. Stotsky surely did not see a political event. I will submit to you today that our state board is the political entity. Its members are unelected. They are political appointees, unaccountable to the people, and they have lost the public trust. From the Independent Education Audit of 2012, quote, "We have encountered no other state that insulates its education system so much from gubernatorial or voter control." A possible solution for this comes from the West Virginia State Farm Bureau, who recently passed a statewide resolution calling for the State Board of Education to become an elected body by the people of West Virginia. It was Governor Manchin, now United States Senator Manchin, who signed us up for Common Core and the Smarter Balanced Consortium. And at a town hall in St. Mary's with the senator, I shared this FERPA information with him. He knew nothing about the FERPA changes. And quoting from the Parkersburg News and Sentinel article that covered the event, quote, Senator Manchin said, "Programs such as Race to the Top and Common Core have gone horribly wrong." I will submit to you today that our current governor has never, to my knowledge, publicly said the words Common Core. A year ago, we publicly and by the mail requested the governor impose a 2-year moratorium on the assessments so that we may study these issues. We received no response, not even a form letter. The matter is now urgent. A world-renowned Stanford mathematician and standards expert, Dr. James Milgram, tells us after 4 years under poor standards like Common Core, the damage to students is irreparable. Governor Tomlin, today I am calling you out. You have ignored our concerns and put the West Virginia children's education in crisis. There will be bills that are anti-Common Core that comes out of this legislature, and it is time for you, Governor Tomlin, to acknowledge the problem and help us get this fixed. Chief Justice John Roberts said, "The states are separate and independent sovereigns, and sometimes they have to act like it." We want West Virginia to act like it. We realize that no decisions will be reached here today, and we thank this committee for the opportunity to speak. Today is the beginning discussion, and it must not be the last. Ultimately, we must recognize that Common Core is the federalization of education. We cannot piecemeal the eradication of Common Core. The standards, the assessments, and the data collection are all intertwined within the grants and agreements. We must get rid of it all to fix the problem. We need legislation that will remove Common Core standards from West Virginia schools, withdraw us from the SBAC, and stop this expansion, collection, and sharing of student data. And we absolutely must, restore and affirm West Virginia's commitment to parental rights, naming parents as the final authority over their child's education. Today, we look forward to new committees, new leadership, fresh faces and new ideas in the West Virginia legislature. A legislature that we hope will act as true representatives of the people. My head tells me to be cautiously optimistic, but my heart is leaping for joy at the promise of change coming to West Virginia. The Common Core War is a battle we cannot lose. If we lose, we are going to lose our children, and if we lose our children, we have lost our nation.
I'd like to thank the chair and the committee for inviting me here today to speak in West Virginia. My name is Otha Thornton, and I'm testifying today not only as the president of the largest child advocacy organization in our nation, but also as a parent and a retired member of the military. I am also a child of Appalachia. I'm from Elberton, Georgia. It's the southernmost part of the Appalachian economic zone in the United States, and a family member of the third generation of granite miners in Elberton, Georgia. Speaking as the president of National PTA, a voice for all children, Common Core is critical in offering opportunities for every child. As the largest volunteer child advocacy association in the nation with more than 4 million members, National PTA speaks with a powerful voice on behalf of every child to provide the best tools for parents and communities to help their children become successful students. National PTA volunteers have adopted several position statements and resolutions beginning in 1981 in support of voluntary, clear, higher academic standards for all students. The West Virginia PTA and its leadership is also a branch of our National PTA composed of 7,300 members across this state. Implementing the Common Core does not sacrifice educational liberty. We're empowering parents by clearly stating rigorous expectations for their children and building a framework that will facilitate meaningful communication between all stakeholders in a child's education. The Common Core state standards are true, internationally benchmarked standards and are better than the patchwork that was often the old state standards. We must dedicate ourselves in doing whatever is needed to ensure that our children are prepared for college or career outside or inside of West Virginia. The Common Core gives every child the opportunity to achieve the highest levels and is the best chance that we have to prepare our children for the future. Speaking as a concerned father, I think it's important for us to address the rampant misinformation that parents are hearing about the Common Core. Throughout our work over the last 5 years, we have heard a variety of concerns discussed by well-meaning parents who only want the best for their children. However, we believe it is important to identify the real cause of the concerns. After digging deeper, many parents are finding that their concerns are not actually related to the standards themselves, but rather issues surrounding the implementation, which might include teacher training, aligning curriculum, lesson plans, or homework. Another area that has caused real concerns is around assessments, which includes the testing schedule, accountability, or privacy. It is a myth that Common Core or a national curriculum that will dumb down our kids. Fact, the Common Core state standards do not dictate the details of academic curriculum. They only provide a clear expectation of what each student must know to leave school and prepare for a college or career. Standards equal the end goal, or the what. Curriculum equals the how. These terms are not interchangeable. It is a myth that Common Core is expanding standardized testing or that students will be tested on information that they have not learned. Fact, as states implement new college and career-ready standards, they will also transition to the new assessments designed to better measure whether our students are on track for college or career readiness. The new test will replace old state testing, not add to it. Or for the first time, comparable achievement information will be available from state to state. National PTA believe the assessments should be used to help parents and teachers determine the specific academic needs of the students and increase the opportunities for students as outlined in the National PTA position statement regarding assessments. It is a myth that Common Core standards are not internationally benchmarked and were not approved by the validation committee. Fact, international benchmarking played a significant role in the creation of the standards. The criteria used for writing the standards and the list of the validation committee are readily available. It is a myth that states are not leading this effort. that the federal government is taking over the education system or that the governors are forced to sign on before the standards were written. Fact, development of the Common Core was well on its way prior to Race to the Top was even introduced. And the federal government only got involved after it became a great interest for reform that existed amongst the states. In April 2009, the National Governors Association and the Council of the Chief School State Officers convened to discuss the creation of the Common Core State Standards Initiative. And based upon the state's interests, development of the standards began in May. The governors and the state schools chiefs from 48 states and the District of Columbia then signed a memorandum of agreement to develop the Common Core on June 1st, 2009. The Race to the Top competition was announced nearly 2 months later on July the 24th. It is a myth that states were coerced in adopting the Common Core state standards with Race to the Top and other federal funding. Fact, states and districts who applied for Race to the Top funds were not required to adopt Common Core standards. States and districts who applied for Race to the Top funds were required to adopt college and career-ready standards and assess students. In addition, the federal government, Common Core is not a mechanism for federal data collection. Federal law, or FERPA, prohibits the reporting of aggregate data that could identify individual students. In addition, the federal government does not have access to student-level data in accordance with state and federal law and will continue these practices under the new assessments. Each state has its unique challenges, but it is important not to back away from demanding the highest expectations of our children via the new Common Core standards. The great thing about Common Core is that it sets the bar for what children should know at the end of each school year, but preserves the state's decision-making power on how the standards become a reality. From lesson plans to curriculum to assessments and accountability, it is up to the state. It is absolutely critical to separate out these issues. Let's leave the high bar and concentrate our efforts on how to make the standards work effectively and efficiently in every state. Finally, speaking as a retired military member, Common Core allows for the first time in history our armed service members to be able to transfer from state to state without fear that their children will be falling behind in their studies or repeating information that they have already learned. It allows our military members to do their jobs without feeling like our children must make sacrifices in their education along the way. Finally, but another reason that the Common Core is critical in pushing the children of our great nation further than we have in the past military readiness, a 2010 study from an education trust found that roughly 1 in 5 high school graduates fail the military entry exam, meaning that the candidates who want to serve cannot because the education system has failed them. The military provides higher education opportunities to low-income families who otherwise may not have the opportunity to afford a college education. To wrap up my testimony today, I'm going to put my National PTA President hat back on and talk about our moral obligation to our children of West Virginia and all of our children across the nation. We're talking about raising the bar in education. We owe our children an education that promises each child when they receive a diploma that it actually means something. It means that they are ready for college and that they will not need to spend money for remedial classes that don't count towards a degree. It means that kids headed to technical schools or straight into the careers have the critical thinking and problem-solving skills that employers demand of their new employees. And it means that we are honoring a commitment to ensuring that kids from our country can compete in the global arena. To remain competitively globally, businesses across the country depend upon a highly qualified workforce prepared for jobs in the 21st century. Today's workplace requires employees to be able to think on their feet, make decisions, and solve problems. As the demand for highly skilled workers continue to increase, it is imperative that America's youth are prepared with critical thinking and reasoning skills necessary to engage our complex work environments. West Virginia has a lot at stake in your decisions around Common Core. In the Annie Casey Foundation's annual Kids Count report in 2014, West Virginia is ranked 46 in the nation in education, which is a slight improvement from where the state had previously been ranked last year, 47. West Virginia's per pupil educational expenditures is $14,147 per pupil for the latest reporting of the cost. National PTA encourages you to listen to the great majority of parents and teachers that support this transition rather than letting politics interfere with the important goal of improving outcomes for students. When the West Virginia Department of Education brought together 100 teachers to review Common Core, they found that 80%, I say again, 80% of the old English language arts and 73% of the old math standards align perfectly with Common Core. That's a fact. This is not political, and this is not a major shift from your old standards. In our work across the country, we have visited classrooms, talked with students, teachers who are excited about the improvements happening in schools. We see students being challenged, and we have seen teachers enthusiastically embracing the new standards, and we see parents becoming more engaged with their children's education. As I mentioned earlier, we currently have the next generation standards here, which are very closely aligned with Common Core, and we have made progress in this great state of West Virginia. In our efforts to engage parents and communities about Common Core, we have conducted in-depth training to more than 60,000 parents and have educated more than 3 million people about the importance of college and career readiness standards, because these state standards promise to finally bring consistency to an education system that has fallen behind. We have partnered with school districts and curriculum directors across the country, all of whom are excited and are very excited about the increased rigor and the clarity of Common Core. In short, public support for Common Core is strong once they are educated on the benefits that it will present to its students. Early data from Kentucky Department of Education suggests that Common Core standards is improving outcomes for their students. In their last assessment using their old test measuring their older standards, 75% of the students were considered college or career ready. When the standards were raised under Common Core and the new tests were used, less than 50% of the students in Kentucky were considered college or career ready. Although their test scores initially dipped, today we are seeing improvement, and their Department of Education today are reporting 62% of their students being college or career ready, and that's based upon a new higher standard. PTA understands that new standards means teachers, schools need to take time to make the necessary adjustments to ensure success. New standards cannot be implemented effectively overnight. Teachers need time to learn about the standards, align curriculum, and receive appropriate professional development. We will also need new assessments that will properly measure mastery of these standards. States need to take the time to make their own decisions regarding curriculum, assessments, and new accountability models. PTA supports Common Core because it is voluntary, derived at the state level with the involvement of parents and teachers, and long overdue increase in rigor. Standards are goals. They give teachers and parents clear objectives at each grade level. They are the stepping stone to ensure that their high school diploma means that they are prepared for work in college. National PTA in West Virginia stand firm in our position to properly implement and assess the Common Core state standards. National PTA will continue to work with all education partners to ensure the highest quality of education. State leaders who believe in improved educational outcomes for all students should reaffirm their commitment to the Common Core as we celebrate the potential it offers to the students of West Virginia. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee, and I also thank you for your commitment to the children and the families of West Virginia.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. Let me first tell you a little bit about who I am. Not only was I at the University of Arkansas for over 5.5 years as a chair in teacher quality and a professor in the Graduate School of Education. Earlier, I had been in the Massachusetts Department of Education, where I had been in charge of the development or revision of all of our K-12 standards from 1999 to 2003. And I was at the same time, and this is an important part of my story, I was also in charge of all the revisions needed for our teacher licensure tests and our teacher licensure regulations. I was the master controller taking care of making sure that all planes took off simultaneously and landed safely with the right stuff in them. I was also later on the Massachusetts State Board of Education and at the same time on Common Core's Validation Committee. I had earlier been involved with Achieve Incorporated in serving as someone who helped to benchmark with the Massachusetts English Language Arts standards, other states' standards, because our document was considered the best one in the country. So I have helped to work on the American Diploma Project, as well as other activities for Achieve Incorporated. Let me begin by reviewing what is in a handout that I believe the members of the committee have. It's a several-page handout. I am a handout person, not a PowerPoint person. So I just want you to know that all of these pages in my handout package are available on the web, both on my homepage for the University of Arkansas or elsewhere. But the Common Core fact sheet, which is 2 pages long, beginning of this little packet, will give those of you who are not familiar with some of the basic facts about Common Core from the perspective of someone who participated in almost every activity that Common Core was involved with. You should also be aware of the fact that we're dealing with a set of standards that were developed by 3 private organizations, not just the National Governors Association and the Council for Chief State School Officers, but also Achieve Incorporated, and they were all funded for this purpose by a 4th private organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you need to keep this large cast of characters in mind. Who were most of the people developing the original list of college-ready standards? Turns out that they were mainly people in test and curriculum development, the very people who are now profiting from a lot of the implementation activities associated with Common Core. When we get to actually who wrote the standards, which is where I came into action on the validation committee, it then turns out that most of the key writers for both the ELA and the math standards had no K-12 teaching experience at all. The ELA, English Language Arts writers, had no degree in English or English literature. They had no prior involvement with K-12 education. Indeed, they were totally unknown to everyone in the field. And a good part of the problems, the flaws with Common Core, both in math and in ELA, goes back to the lack of qualifications of the standards writers. Who chose them, why they were chosen, to this day we still don't know, because everything was done non-transparently. I kept asking for information records when I was a member of the validation committee and could not get to this day any information on who chose these people, why they were chosen, what their contract said, what they were paid, what was their charge. None of that's available at all to understand the origins of these very flawed standards. Let me briefly indicate why Massachusetts gave up its very good standards, and that you will see on the second page of the handout. I was on the State Board of Education at the time, appointed by outgoing, at that time, Governor Romney, and I can tell you that as a member of the State Board, we all knew that Massachusetts would get $250 million in Race to the Top money if it gave up its first-class standards. So Race to the Top was a clear incentive. It worked in different ways in different states, but we certainly knew in Massachusetts why we had given up the best standards in both math and English in the country. Let me get briefly to the validation committee. I was one of the 5 people on this very small committee who would not sign off on these standards, and Professor Jim Milgram, whose name you heard mentioned earlier, the mathematician from Stanford University, who was the only mathematician on the validation committee, which raises a question about who was on this validation committee. We were the 2 experts. I was the sole English language arts standards expert. He was the only mathematician. We did not sign off for 3 major reasons. They were not rigorous, they were not research-based, and they were not internationally benchmarked standards. So we saw flawed standards from the beginning and knew that part of the problem were the writers themselves. I will also point out that these standards also do not lead to equity, and I will get to that point later on. Let me briefly point out that you will see, if you had the packet in front of you, that the next page are the flaws in Common Core's English Language Arts and Literacy standards. I have written that, and this explains why I wouldn't sign off. And the next 2 pages are titled Missing or Delayed Mathematics Standards in Common Core's Math Standards, produced by Professor Milgram and Zev Werman, who also is in California and was on California's Academic Assessment Commission. And between the 2 of these pages, you can get a sense of all the problems with these standards. They are so far from being first-class standards for this country that what surprises us to this day is that we do not have people from higher ed being asked to speak to them. So far, I don't see any teaching faculty person from a math, science, or engineering department speaking about these standards. And West Virginia has a lot to worry about because it is on the verge of an economic boom, and yet it has adopted standards that will take it back to the 19th century. What are the problems in math, briefly? And you can always contact Professor Milgram to explain the standards to you, as I am not a mathematician. There is no pathway to STEM. The governor has appointed people to look into how to get more people into STEM, and yet Common Core comes out with math standards that lack the standards that are needed for getting high school students to a STEM major or career. Is it only his judgment? No. We had one of the standards writers come to Massachusetts in March 2010, Jason Zimba, and I asked him as a member of the Board of Ed to explain what college readiness meant. He very candidly said, and it's captured on an official tape of that meeting, that it meant minimal college readiness. It meant no pathway to STEM, he said that you would not be able to get engineering students prepared from Common Core's math standards. The ELA standards present different issues. I have laid them out on my one-pager, which you can read through as it's too detailed to read aloud here, and I don't have the time. The main thing you need to understand is that the standards are primarily skills. What do I mean by a skill? Let me quickly read from the central section. To determine a theme or central idea of a text, analyze in detail its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, and provide an objective summary of the text. Now, that is a poorly written standard that my own high school English teacher would have never allowed me to come out with. It can be applied, because it's a skill or a process, to Moby Dick or to Three Little Pigs. There's nothing in it that addresses the level of literary knowledge, literary history, or a specific reading level. This is the problem with almost all of the ELA standards in Common Core. And I give you two examples of authentic ELA standards on my page. So you have to understand that part of the problem with Common Core's ELA standards is that it can't develop reading comprehension or critical thinking because there are no content-based standards there. They are skills or processes. It's an empty curriculum. Another side issue that stems from all of these problems has been the revolt of parents all over the country. I have been speaking, as everyone knows, in about 30 different states and completed with Professor Milgram a 13-city speaking tour last month in California. Thousands of parents are very concerned, not because of the misinformation they've been given, but because they're looking at what their children are doing in the schools, and they're capable of understanding that what they're seeing in the elementary grades makes no sense. And yet, there isn't anybody from the US ED speaking to these parents. No governors are speaking to parents. No state boards of education are speaking to these parents. They are being totally ignored everywhere. I was in San Diego when Duncan spoke at a meeting sponsored by CCSSO. He knew picketing, protesting parents were outside the hotel. He didn't invite them in. He didn't even want to acknowledge their presence. We have a serious problem with central planners who are going about their business of central planning and really don't care what is happening in the schools. It's not just an implementation problem, it is a problem with the standards that are there. So where do we go at this point? And what I have suggested at the very end of this document is that in my next book, which will be out in March, and the very last page, is entitled An Empty Curriculum, the Need to Reform Teacher Licensing Regulations and Tests, that if you really want first-class standards for West Virginia, you're going to need to reform teacher education, because that is one of the major sources of our national problem, which has been a 50-year decline, and it won't be remedied until we remedy the problems in our education schools. I have only about a minute left. Let me just indicate a few specifics for West Virginia. Yes, you've spent a lot of money so far on Common Core, but there's no need to throw good money after bad. You can go back to your old standards, which I've been told were about the same as Common Core, until you put committees in operation that will develop first-class standards as we have had them in Massachusetts. You need to have a pathway to STEM in your high schools. You need an educational system that is going to produce teachers capable of teaching to more than Common Core. Right now, they're being locked into teaching only to Common Core, which means teachers will teach to the low expectations. What is the equity issue? And I'm going to end with that. We have an equity issue by a set of standards that do not lead students to STEM careers. Students with high-income parents supporting it, schools with high-income parents supporting it, will make sure that a pre-calculus course, a trigonometry course, is available. Students who are in high schools that are supported by low-income parents who aren't aware of the importance of preparing students for Calculus 1 or STEM careers will not have those courses in them. We're seeing this take place in Massachusetts right now. So you have an equity issue to deal with, and it will become an increasingly serious problem in the future if you do not set up committees to develop first-class standards that lead West Virginia into the 21st century and the positions that will go with your booming economy, which may be staffed by people from other countries that have stronger educational systems than you're going to be able to put into place here. Thank you very much.
My teaching has changed from something static into a dynamic, challenging daily endeavor. Truly, I'm telling you the truth from the classroom. I'm sure we can all remember the old ways of read the story and answer the questions at the end of it. Well, that method is gone, and in its place is the chance for teachers to design a curriculum so that each of our students has the opportunity to learn and to achieve and to become metacognitive learners. That means they're learners who think about the way they think to problem solve and to analyze situations. Let me give you an example from my own classroom. We've been studying Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, before my students ever opened the text, they had visited the Library of Congress website to read oral histories of African Americans living in the Deep South in the 1930s. To differentiate the instruction, I pre-selected a variety of histories that had varying degrees of difficulty. From these oral histories, each student selected one and sifted through the words of that person to find their essence, and then take those words and turn them into a found poem. Also, at the Library of Congress website, they examined photographs of small towns in Alabama during the 1930s. They analyzed the photographs using some guided questions, and then they developed their own questions about what it must have been like to live in that era. Additionally, they explored the Library of Congress collection of photographs from the Jim Crow era, and they reflected on how it might have felt to have experienced that kind of prejudice. The students also participated in a free write. The topic, tell it about an experience from your childhood that has profoundly affected you, whether positively or negatively. The next day, we pulled our desks into a large circle and shared our stories. Because my students are used to small and large group discussions, their comfort level with each other was high. And the stories they shared that day made us both laugh and cry. Atticus Finch's dictum of, you never really understand someone until you see things from their point of view, came alive in my classroom that day, and the students hadn't even opened the book yet. From reading the Look magazine article, The Shocking Story of a Proved Killing in Mississippi, about the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, they learned that the atrocities committed against African Americans during the lynching era didn't end with the 1930s. And of course, they read about the Scottsboro Boys trial and the fates of those 9 young men. And remember, we haven't opened the book yet. But when we did, the students were ready to embrace the book at a much deeper level of cognition. They connected their previous learning to better understand and analyze the themes of the novel. From their close reading assignments, they investigated portions of text with a magnifying glass. Close reading these excerpts helped all students make richer connections with the author's craft: diction, vocabulary, imagery, characterization, and basic mechanics, commas and periods, just to name a few, that cause a text to come alive. The students had been learning the skill of close reading all semester, first with my scaffolding in a whole group setting, and later in small groups. By carefully selecting my groups, pairing varying levels of ability, these students worked collaboratively while helping each other learn. Before we got to the chapters of Tom Robinson's trial, we staged our own courtroom scene using a script taken right from the dialogue found in the novel. The next day, our class became the jury, with students being asked to assume the persona of a person who might have been on that jury, and they went through the process of deliberating a verdict. With their 2014 point of view, they knew what the only verdict could be, but their assumed personas led them to the same verdict as in the novel. And by some strange twist of fate, the Michael Brown and Eric Garner grand jury decisions came down right when we reached the last chapters of the novel. My students devoured editorials and news stories and held thoughtful discussions. Having served on a classroom jury themselves, they had a richer understanding of the process involved. They are young citizens who question what they read and who know not to take things at face value. They are students who have learned to think about the way they think and learn. They are able to transfer their knowledge from the classroom to their lives. And when my students demonstrate what they have learned, they don't do it by answering multiple choice questions. They write about their learning. They make a claim, back up their claim with textual evidence, synthesizing information from all of the resources studied, and they convince me through their analysis that their evidence supports their assertions. The rigor in my classrooms made possible through the implementation of the next generation standards has elevated student engagement and learning. When students recognize the relevance of what they are learning to their own lives, the learning becomes authentic. I love the phrase, an inch wide and a mile deep, that we English language arts teachers use to describe how we teach under our next generation standards. As they assist me in designing my curriculum, I have more opportunity than ever before to augment my curriculum with a vast array of rich resources. I'm challenged as an educator to find materials that will stimulate critical thinking and real-world connections. And with every unit, I require myself to be a reflective practitioner. What worked well? What didn't? What will I do differently next time? I also teach this process to my students so they can see that is how one improves one's own performance. I stand before you today speaking about my own experiences in the classroom. However, in my role of 2015 West Virginia Teacher of the Year, I've interacted with teachers who feel the same about their experiences with the next generation standards. The depth of the content gives our students opportunities to explore why things function as they do, rather than just being taught an algorithm. This enables them to become metacognitive practitioners and better problem solvers. The rigorous classrooms produced by our next generation standards are preparing West Virginia students for high school graduation and for college and career readiness. In fact, just this past weekend, the West Virginia Association of School Administrators voted to stay the course with the West Virginia Next Generation Content Standards and Objectives, saying it would be disastrous to change as we are just now fully implementing the standards. Our students are the future, and they will be prepared. Now, I brought with me, I couldn't bring a student today because it's exam week at Park, but I asked the student if she'd just write about something that she learned in my class as a result of the lessons that I presented. She doesn't talk about the To Kill a Mockingbird, but she talks about one that I do on man versus technology. And I think she wants an A this 9 weeks because she starts out with superlatives about me, but don't pay attention. Being an honors student at Wheeling Park High School, I've had a lot of experience with great teachers, but none of them have cared like Mrs. Adams. The second we walk into her classroom, we start learning, and it's not boring. Ms. Adams encourages us to have group discussions, ask questions, and interact with one another. At the beginning of the year, we learned about man versus technology. And instead of reading thousands of ancient stories about technology taking over, we watched videos, documentaries, and read news articles. Ms. Adams taught us what she was supposed to do without putting us all to sleep. I've never been interested in science fiction, but I enjoyed learning about it in her class. Along with learning about man versus technology, we learned how to do close reading of literature. Boy, was that fun. Ms. Adams will often say her teaching style is an inch wide and a mile deep, which is very true. But I'm glad she teaches that way. We annotated short stories, and I was astonished by what my mind was finding in these stories. I started to realize foreshadowings and allusions without Miss Adams having to point it out. We also discussed our annotations, and it was amazing to see what my classmates got out of the same story that I didn't. Hearing my classmates' input really helped me more than just being read to in class, ever would have. Throughout the semester, Miss Adams has truly impacted my life as a student, and has inspired me to work harder and to take pride in my studies. Her styles of an inch wide and a mile deep and Socratic discussions have helped me learn so much this semester, and I'm thankful for that. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to address this body. Accountability Works is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to assist states, schools, and parents in implementing high-quality standards, assessments, and evidence-based practices. I have a presentation which hopefully can load momentarily, but while it's doing that, I want to say my background is in primarily in curriculum and standards and assessment. Working on this, I'm going to focus on Common Core math, and I had input from R. James Milgram, who's a nationally renowned mathematician even before he got involved with Common Core, and Zev Werman, and some of the topics on instruction, which I want to highlight. My collaborator, Kathleen Madigan, Dr. Madigan, and I worked on that, and it's going to be addressed in more depth in a forthcoming paper that we're working on. So I'm going to start with talking about international competitiveness, which is a focus, one of the main selling points of Common Core. When we have international comparisons, such as the TIMSS study of achievement in mathematics, sometimes it's reported as the U.S. performing in the middle of the pack. Some countries perform better, some countries perform worse, and we're somewhere in the middle. What gets lost in those headlines or those summaries is that countries who tend to perform worse than us, now this is a graph of performance at the advanced level in the TIMSS at 8th grade. Advanced is roughly the level that students need to be on track to get the math and science they need in high school to have an option of pursuing a STEM career in high school. And so if you look at this, the countries that are performing significantly below the U.S. are countries like Kazakhstan and Ghana. The countries that are performing better than us, the top performing countries like Singapore, Korea, Japan, those are in the top tier internationally. And so in terms of economic competitiveness, it really doesn't help the U.S. that we're doing better than Kazakhstan. With the countries that we're competing with for with billions of dollars of investment from businesses or the top tier countries. We're far below. The top tier countries are getting close to half, 48, 49% of their students by 8th grade, achieving at a level that gives them an option of a STEM career. The U.S. is at 7%. So these top countries are getting 7 times as many students on this track. So there's a real issue, and Common Core would be great if Common Core helped to address that, but it doesn't. Can we get the next slide? And sometimes we hope that even though our top students are not performing, or our average students are not performing at that level, that we have an emphasis on equity, and maybe we're doing better with some of the bottom students. In fact, that's not correct. And so the percentage of students that are at the intermediate level, which is a fairly low level of TIMS, in the top performing countries is around 90%. Around 90% of our 8th grade students get to at least that level. In the U.S., it's about 68%, and West Virginia is a little below that. By the way, my slides will be available afterward for those of you who can't read those. Next. So how do they do it? The high-achieving countries, the top-tier countries in math, do it by teaching in an accelerated fashion on what really matters, the elementary grades, and having their students complete the content of what we cover in Algebra 1 and Geometry, but pretty much all of that content by the end of 8th grade. Now, you know you have different speakers asserting all kinds of things. The quotes below that are from Benchmarking for Success, a report that Achieve, which is one of the main backers of Common Core, worked on, and it says, in fact, the curriculum studied by the typical American 8th grader is 2 full years behind the curriculum being studied by 8th graders in high-performing countries, and they cite mathematical educator William Schmidt. And so this is how they get to those levels. They accelerate students, they get this advanced content covered by 8th grade, whereas our students are just starting Algebra 1, typically in 9th grade. So what does Common Core do? So the main track in Common Core is that they have K-8 standards through 8th grade, and Algebra 1 and 2, and Geometry in 9th and higher grades. If that sounds familiar, that's because that is the typical track now for most students. Now, so it doesn't move us closer to getting that advanced content at earlier levels with the prerequisite skills that students need to be successful before that. When Common Core was criticized for that in an earlier draft, they created this other track, which is not the main track, by just pushing some of their 8th grade standards down to 7th grade. This is an alternate track, it's not the main track, but they created this other path to respond to that criticism. Unfortunately, since it's not the main track, this tracking approach will actually serve to perpetuate some of the racial and class inequities that we have today in access to high-quality international competitive curriculum. So students in schools where they have more fluent parents are going to demand a higher quality elementary curriculum are the ones that are going to be prepared to actually succeed at these levels when they get to middle school. The other students that have been following the main track are not going to be ready in 8th grade to just cover 7th grade, cover 2 years of that basically, which is what the standards show. The alternate track can be able to succeed. So Common Core perpetuates, it doesn't help ameliorate some of these inequities that we have a serious problem in this country. So next slide. So what does Common Core really do? So if Common Core is not helping our students to reach more advanced levels of content, prepare them for internationally competitive STEM careers, what is its focus? The main effect of Common Core is changes to the instruction, to the how, not the what, not the higher level of bar, but the how, the methods that are used to teach, the how that's used to teach. And some of the most damaging aspects of Common Core draw on a movement that really began in the turn of the 20th century. It's called educational progressivism. It's an ideology. And at the next slide, it had many streams, had multiple areas. It addressed, in historical terms, it addressed reforms in management, which were designed to actually have some good. They helped root out corruption. So progressivism had some positive impacts. But what I'm going to focus on is pedagogical progressivism. And that's what Common Core is really pushing. And those have been pretty much disproven by most educational research. It's quality research at a large scale. Next slide. So the pedagogy of Common Core, which is pervasive throughout the Common Core standards, is often sold as leading to real learning or true understanding. In fact, educational progressivism and instruction has a number of elements that are really more like assumptions. They're not a coherent theory. They're biases or dogmas that are just assumed to be true. And there are several of them, but I'm going to focus on one, a false dichotomy between math facts and math and procedural computational fluency with higher order conceptual understanding. Next slide. So this is just a bias in the standards and in the field. The issues with it were first noticed, the resistance to Common Core started with two moms in Indiana. And if you can't read that, I'll read the last two paragraphs of that. They were actually Catholic schools because this is being pushed in private and home schools as well through the economic power of Common Core to direct publishers to focus on it. Instead of any arithmetic problems, said one of the parents, the homework would contain only 3 or 4 questions, and 2 of those would be explain your answer. Heather told me, like, one bridge is 412 feet long, and the other bridge is 206 feet long. Which bridge is longer? How do you know? She found she could not help her daughter answer the latter question, how do you know 400-something is bigger than 200-something? The right answer involved heavy quotation from Common Core language, a program designed to encourage thought and ended up encouraging rote memorization, not of math, but of scripts of math. Next slide. So when you bring up these examples, there are usually 2 responses by Common Core advocates. One is to just dismiss the parents. What do they know? The parents, conspiracy theories, what do they know? Just parents. The second approach is to blame the textbooks and the implementation. Well, that must just be a bad implementation, that particular textbook, and that training. In fact, it's actually pervasive through Common Core. So when you pick up Common Core, you just focus on individual standards. It's very hard to notice it. So a systematic study that's done of Common Core by Andrew Porter, who was actually philosophically, and he mentioned this in his paper, he's sympathetic to the progressivist approach of Common Core, analyzed and found that the Common Core shifts the emphasis compared to previous state standards from solving problems, creating proofs, doing math, to demonstrating, understanding. What's meant by that is actually talking about, communicating about mathematics. So it actually quantitatively shifts the focus when you look across the standards, so we're talking about that and doing it. Next slide. And so he also looked at the emphasis in the internationally top-ranked countries in this area. So for example, at grade 8, which has some of the highest disparity, Common Core emphasis on actually performing procedures, doing math, is only 38% of the Common Core math standards at 8th grade, whereas the top-performing countries, their standards focused on actually solving problems and doing math at 75%. So Common Core is not only not benchmarked to international competitive standards on the higher levels of content, it doesn't at all follow the successful approaches of these top-achieving countries. It moves further away from following these approaches. Next. So I'll give you one brief example. For those of you who can't read it, that's also available later. The Common Core standards, and I'll just read one standard for 2nd grade, fluently add and subtract within 100, and that's the what. But then it goes on to talk about the how, using strategies based on place value, properties of operations, and our relation to addition and subtraction. So the bottom line is Common Core delays the introduction of standard algorithms, which are the efficient, scalable approaches that all students will eventually need to learn, until the last standard, the 4th grade standard. And why? It does it because of this false dichotomy, this idea that you can't teach computational fluency with a standard algorithm while you're actually teaching conceptual understanding. This is the progressivist dogma. Whereas on the right, you see Singapore, which is representative of all the top achieving countries. And I'll just mention the second bullet, primary, grade 1, addition and subtraction using formal algorithms. So they start in grade 1, they do it gradually with small numbers, they teach conceptual and computational fluency, and students have a chance to learn that gradually and develop those 2 in a way that's mutually reinforcing. Common Core introduces standard algorithms all of a sudden in 4th grade. And it requires mastery. Students have to unlearn these alternative, non-scalable approaches that they have to practice, as it says in standards, to fluency. And they have to unlearn all that in when. In 1 year, they have to succeed in the standard algorithms, understand what they're doing, and be able to do it. This is not effective practice. And so just in closing, just want to make a couple quick points. Next slide. Common Core is often touted as being pushed by the states, and that as an evidence for its federalism. Well, what kind of federalism? Well, a lot of countries as well have some kind of federalism. Germany claims to have a federal system. It's very different from the federalism in our Constitution. Justice Brandeis said, in a widely known quote, "A state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments, quote, without risk to the rest of the country." So that's the constitutional type of federalism that we should have in this country. It's called competitive federalism, where states compete to put in high-quality systems, to attract investment, to attract jobs. You don't impose a single monolithic model across the country and try to eliminate other options. And so that's competitive federalism. That's the constitutional form of federalism. It's not states colluding to create what's a kind of cartel enforced through federal incentives and waivers that tries to impose a single national law. And so that's the constitutional type of federalism. And I appreciate that the legislature is getting involved, because even though this is an educational matter, it's the legislature's role to protect the fundamental rights of your citizens. And what this does is it removes a fundamental right of parents to direct the educational content of their children's education, either locally or by appealing to officials in their state that they helped elect, and puts it at the federal level, where parents would have to juggle calling different nonprofit or federal agencies trying to get redress, which is not a serious option. So it's the legislature's role to take steps, protect that fundamental right of parents, to be able to direct that and have it done at the local level. Thank you.
It's standards. So we founded to help states work on their standards. We've worked with more than 40 states since 1996 to do that in one way or another. I want to talk, so we've been in the middle of the standards movement since its founding, and I want to talk a bit about where the Common Core came from. Right? It didn't come from CCS or NGA from the heavens. It certainly didn't come from the Department of Education. It is actually the result of states operating as laboratories of American democracy, working on their own to develop standards. And as they determined that they had common weaknesses in their own separate standards, they decided to work together to solve the common problems that they face. And I will tell you that story in a moment. Secondly, I will talk about the federal government's role in all of this, both historically and currently. And thirdly, some thoughts about what you can do here in West Virginia next. So let me talk first about the evolution of standards. The idea for state standards arose in large part from the National Governors Association in the mid-1980s. And then Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander was the chair of the Governors Association. All the governors together work on a set of education initiatives, and the heart of it was to define the knowledge and skills each student needs to have by the time they complete high school, and measure whether the students are meeting those standards or not, and make sure that those standards were sufficiently rigorous to meet the demands of what was then emerging as a knowledge-based global economy. This was the states leading that effort. Most states developed their standards for the first time in the early 1990s, some of the mid or late 1990s, developed standards, some revised them once already by the end of that decade, but roughly by around 2000, every state had adopted a set of standards, particularly in reading or reading and writing literacy and mathematics. Over the course of the next several years, a number of observers and a number of analysts, including the chief, began to see that there were some common weaknesses in the standards, even though there were 50 different standards. First weakness that we found was that virtually none of the standards that states had adopted were intentionally aligned with the real-world demands that they were going to face. That is, they didn't intentionally reflect the knowledge and skills students need in order to enter and succeed in credit-bearing courses in college. And they didn't reflect the knowledge and skills students needed to have in order to enter post-secondary training programs that would lead to careers that paid well and had advancement. And by the early 2000s, it's already clear that the vast majority of jobs and careers in the future would in fact require some post-secondary education. Yet the standards that have been set, the knowledge and skills students were expected to learn by the time they did not reflect the knowledge and skills that they needed to succeed after high school. Let me just give you a couple of examples of that, and we'll talk about how we addressed it. First of all, to this day, right here in West Virginia, 65% of the students that enter the state's community and technical colleges, 65%, right, require remedial coursework. They have to take courses, right, that teach the skills that they should have learned before they got to college. By the way, they pay college-level tuition. They don't earn college credit. They are half as likely to ever earn a degree or a certificate as their better prepared peers. That's what all standards we're producing for us. In your 11 state colleges and universities, 20% of the first-year students are required to take remedial courses. Again, they don't earn college credit. They do pay college tuition, and they get the same ordeal out of that. Nationally, Chief did a survey of recent high school graduates. We did it in 1994. We just repeated it last week. Right, and what we found was roughly 40 to 45% of recent high school graduates, both those that were in college and those that were already in the workplace. 40 to 45% of them, when I asked, basically said, now that I'm out in the real world, I have some pretty significant gaps in the skills that I got while I was in high school. I'm not prepared with the skills I need to confront the reality that I face. However, we surveyed faculty who taught first-year students in credit-bearing, not remedial credit-bearing courses, and they said, to what extent are your students prepared to do the work in your first-year course? And they estimated about 40% of the students in their first-year credit-bearing course actually aren't prepared to do that work. We asked employers who hire students out of high school and asked them how well prepared they are, and they in turn estimated that about 45% of the high school graduates they hired were okay at the skills necessary for their first entry-level course, entry-level position, but did not have the skills to advance in their company. So they could do their really low-level jobs, but they weren't going anyplace with the skills that they had. Separate from the Chief's work, ACT estimates that about half of the college-bound students are ready for college-level reading. Again, a big gap in the expectations we have for students by the time they contribute high school and what the real world demands of them. So that was one big challenge that was true of virtually all states. Secondly, state standards were literally all over the map. By that I mean there was relatively little consistency in what states were expected to, what students were expected to learn grade by grade in mathematics, for example. The same Andy Porter that you just heard about, that Ted just mentioned, right, did studies in the 1990s that showed that at any given grade level, across about 30 to 35 states, there was only 20% overlap in what students were expected to learn in mathematics. Now, you can debate exactly the pace at which certain things ought to be introduced, but this is basically a highly structured discipline. We learn some things first, we learn other things next, it goes forward. To have that kind of disparity suggested that we were disadvantaging students significantly. The reading standards, won't go into detail here, but reading standards had similar problems. In this case, there's actually no progression from grade to grade. Students that read a text, identify the main idea, and move on. The complexity of the text did increase. The kind of questions they were asked to respond to did increase. There was really no progression from grade to grade. Thirdly, the state tests that are given or that have been given, they too were sort of all over the map in several ways. First of all, Chief did a study of high school graduation tests. 5 states, Massachusetts, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and Indiana. And we asked, what do those tests measure and what do students need to know in order to pass the test? So in the math test, right, students who passed those tests that were typically given in 10th grade, but they were actually required to demonstrate the knowledge and skills that students in high-performing countries learn in the 8th grade. 10th grade tests, they're called high school graduation tests. They don't measure college and career-ready skills, they measure 8th grade skills. That was one thing that was true of state high school testing programs. The second is No Child Left Behind passed, and states began to administer the National Assessment of Educational Progress every 2 years, right, which is a sample. That's a sample of students in each state. The percentage of students who perform proficient on that common benchmark varied quite a bit in comparison to the percentage of students who perform proficient on the state test. Just an example here, in West Virginia in 2013, 27% of fourth graders scored proficient on the NAEP reading test, right? In that same year, 47% of fourth graders scored proficient on the state reading test. A big difference in what proficient means. The American Institutes of Research did a study of international performance standards recently. They found, with regard to West Virginia, in 2011, 41% of eighth graders in West Virginia were considered proficient on the state test, whereas only 21% would be proficient considered against international benchmarks. So the tests were similarly all over the map, if you will, quite a bit of difference in what the definition of proficient was. So these are problems that states have in common. Test run, standards were not aligned to the real world. Passed, there was very little consistency, understandable consistency across the states, and the tests showed quite a bit of inconsistency as well. But sizing that up, states began to work together to address those problems. One of the biggest instances of that was the American Diploma Project, an effort started by Chief, by Senator Stotsky and Jim Milton, both on our advisory committee, and we first did research in 5 states to identify the must-have knowledge and skills for students in order to be ready to enter and succeed in credit-bearing, not remedial courses, credit-bearing courses, the first course that they would typically encounter. We pointed out when we released that research the big gaps between those expectations and what most states had, and challenged states to take on responsibility of closing that expectations gap in their standards. Long story short, 35 states joined the American Diploma Project, and we're going to work on those states, work on those standards. They each work on their own standards, one at a time, although we occasionally put them together, teams of higher ed and K-12 to talk about what they were doing. And as they completed revised their high school standards, after 15 of them had done it, we looked across the standards and we found that we could identify a common core of expectations across those states, because they had done in their state what David Spence said the California State University system did in their state. They higher ed than they, right? They forced them to talk about the knowledge and skills students need in order to enter and succeed in credit-bearing courses. They built those in state by state into their own standards, and it turns out when you ask the question, what's the evidence about the skills students need to succeed after high school, the answer does not matter very much what state they're in. These are real-world demands in a global economy. They are not dependent on the state and the state's geographic boundaries. When that happened, when states saw that by doing this work, they could come up with common standards, with a common core. That gave both an intellectual foundation and a practical foundation for the idea of states working intentionally to create common standards. And that's when the Governors Association and Chief State School Officers launched an effort to create the Common Core standards. 48 states signed up to participate in that. They committed not to adopt standards at the end. They committed to be part of the process to develop the standards, to have their educators involved in the process. So that's a different story than you've heard where the Common Core came from. I just wanted to point that out. Very quickly, the federal government's role. Federal government has been a partner in state standards since 1990. When Lamar Alexander was Secretary of Education, he awarded grants to over 45 states to help underwrite the cost of each state developing their own standards. He also awarded grants to national organizations, the National Council of Teachers of English and History to develop a separate history to develop a model of national standards. That model effort didn't go so well, but every state developed its own standards. Since then, when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1994, it required states to have reading and math standards, grade for all kids, the same expectations. It required them to have tests in selective grades. it provided money to the states to pay for those development of those standards and those tests.
In 30 seconds.
In 2002, No Child Left Behind doubled down on that, right, and provided funding for each state to develop its own tests year in and year out. West Virginia gets about $4 million a year from the federal government to pay for your state testing program. Let me point out, you and every other state has been receiving federal money to support standards and tests for 2 decades now. You have not given up state control of your expectations and standards. You've not given up local control over curriculum. You still own the responsibility for that, and that has not changed with the Common Core. I have more to say, but no more time than wish to say it.